Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into something that, well, people often call the missing link in business.
Hmm.
You see companies, really smart people, brilliant strategies, plenty of resources, and yet somehow they consistently fall short. They don't hit their promises.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, our source for this deep dive argues it boils down to a fundamental gap, a gap between, the big goals leaders set and the organization's actual ability to deliver on them.
And this gap, it exists because companies lack what the authors call the discipline of execution.
Right.
It sounds, I don't know, maybe simple, almost boring, but it's actually profoundly difficult and, they argue, completely essential.
The source we're digging into today is the book Execution, The Discipline of Getting Things Done. Came out in 2002, co-authored by two heavy hitters. Larry Bossidy, he's chairman and CEO of Honeywell International, and Ram Charan, who's like this legendary advisor to CEOs globally. And Charles Burke also worked on it with him.
So our mission here, really, is to pull out the absolute core stuff, the key insights from this book, give you a shortcut to understanding not just what execution is, but why it's such a massive difference maker.
Because they're not just talking about, tactics or ticking boxes. Not at all.
No.
They make this really powerful case that execution is a discipline. It's a system. It's deeply woven into strategy. And here's the kicker. It is the major job of any business leader.
That's the key part, isn't it?
If you're leading, they're basically saying, this is your real work.
It kind of pushes back against that common idea, That strategy is the leader's lofty job, and execution is, well, something you delegate.
Yeah, hand it off.
They fundamentally disagree with that, very strongly.
All right, so let's get into why this is needed. The book calls it the gap nobody knows. What's that about?
Well, it starts with a problem you see everywhere. Companies with smart leaders, really inspiring visions. They even hire the best consultants, but they just can't seem to hit their targets consistently. The authors tell this story about a CEO they call Joe.
Ah, yes, Joe.
Now, Joe, by all conventional measures, did everything right. Great strategy, made some smart acquisitions, set those big stretch goals, try to empower his people.
Sounds like the playbook.
Exactly. Yet, he gets fired, missed earnings 4 times in 9 months.
Ouch.
And the crucial thing, he didn't actually understand why. Why were they missing the goals? That's the blind spot.
And that is the core of this gap, isn't it? Strategies, even really good ones, often fail not because the idea is wrong,
Right.
but because the organization just isn't capable of pulling it off. Or the leaders totally misjudge the real-world hurdles involved in making it happen on the ground.
And the market today, it's unforgiving. Execution gets tested every quarter.
Yeah. Immediate consequences.
Think about that Johnson & Johnson's stent example in the book. They literally created the market.
Pioneered it.
And then lost 95% of it by 98. Why? Simply because competitors executed better. They were faster at developing the next tech, better pricing, just better execution.
That's a brutal lesson.
It really is. And another huge case study they detail is that Dell versus Compaq battle back in the late 90s. Remember Eckhard Pfeiffer at Compaq?
Vaguely, yeah.
Yeah.
Big ambitions.
Huge. Kind of trying to be IBM, using the standard PC, Wintel setup, Intel chips, Windows for everything, desktops, servers, the lot. Made massive acquisitions like Tandem and DEC. He really shipped Compaq up.
But Michael Dell had a very different approach, right? And it was built around execution.
Totally. His direct sales built-to-order model, that wasn't just marketing, that was the strategy. The core competitive advantage was how they executed it.
Right. The execution was the strategy, in a way.
Absolutely. Think about it. Building machines only after getting the order, that means hardly any inventory.
While everyone else was sitting on weeks, months, maybe.
Yeah, competitors turn inventory maybe 10, 20 times a year. Dell, 80 times a year.
80. That speed is just staggering.
And it leads to something amazing called negative working capital. Basically, customers pay Dell before Dell has to pay its suppliers.
So they're funded by their customers, effectively.
Which generates insane cash flow. They mentioned Dell pulling in $1 billion from operations in just 1 quarter. And return on invested capital, something like 355% around 2001.
Wow. Just wow.
And that speed, that cost structure, it gave Dell incredible power. They could offer the newest tech faster / prices aggressively, even when the PC market slowed down.
While others were stuck with old inventory.
Exactly. Dell cleaned up. The book even points out that the later Compaq HP merger, They'd need an equally good, if not better, production model just to even compete with Dell's execution machine.
So this gap nobody knows.
Mm.
It's really about leaders being blind to their organization's actual ability to get stuff done, right?
Right.
Separate from the big picture vision.
Precisely. And that's where so many change programs fail. Leaders announce these revolutionary goals, but without the execution discipline to break them down into real, concrete steps, what the book calls next level, reality-based actions, they just fizzle out. Execution is the bridge, the missing link between the dream and the reality.
It does feel like execution became a buzzword for a while.
Yeah.
But maybe people didn't really get what it meant.
I think the authors would agree. They say leaders often just define it vaguely, like attention to detail.
Right.
They even mention boards starting to ask about it, but maybe not asking the really tough questions needed to truly assess if a company can execute.
So it's more than just detail.
Oh, much more. Bossidy and Charan are crystal clear. Execution is a discipline. It's integral to strategy. It's the leader's main job.
Yeah.
And it has to be baked into the company's culture.
They call it a systematic process.
Yeah.
It's about really rigorous discussions about the hows and the whats.
Yeah. Asking the tough questions. Relentless follow through. Demanding accountability.
It's about meshing the strategy with what's actually possible, right?
Yeah.
And getting the right people focused on the right goals. It's a way of forcing reality out into the open.
And they hold up Jack Welch at GE as someone who really embedded that kind of brutal realism into every single process, a true execution culture.
Now, at the heart of their whole framework, they talk about 3 core processes.
Right. The people process, the strategy process, and the operations process.
These are supposed to be the engine of execution. But they say often these things run in separate silos. They're done by rote. There's no real challenge, no robust dialogue.
And here's the critical point. The leader must own these processes. They can't just delegate them to HR or strategic planning or whatever.
That's the big fallacy they identify, the idea that the top leader is somehow exempt from the nuts and bolts.
Exactly. They have to be deeply involved.
They use that sports coach analogy, don't they?
Yeah, a coach isn't effective sitting up in the box office.
Right.
They're down on the field, watching the players, knowing exactly what they can and can't do, giving constant, direct feedback. It's active involvement.
But they're careful to say it's not micromanaging.
No, definitely not. It's about asking those sharp, probing questions. Questions that uncover the weaknesses, but also empower people to figure out the solutions themselves. The leader coaches them to find the answers.
Think about those iconic leaders they mentioned. Jack Welch, Sam Walton, Herb Kelleher. They were such powerful forces because they were in the business. They knew the details intimately. They cared passionately about the results. Welch spending a whole week, 10 hours a day, reviewing operating plans.
Yeah, that wasn't getting lost in the weeds. That was leading through intense, direct engagement with the reality of the business.
Okay, so if it's so critical, and it's the leader's job, why do so many companies neglect it? Why isn't it front and center?
The authors think it's partly because it's not seen as sexy.
Right, the glamour is in the big ideas, the grand strategy.
Exactly. There's this misconception that the real intellectual work, the heavy lifting, is only about creating the vision, not the messy, difficult, rigorous work of actually proving that vision can work in the real world.
They use that Einstein analogy, which I thought was great.
Yeah, proving MCI wasn't just a flash of insight. It required incredibly detailed, complex mathematical execution. Intellectual work he absolutely couldn't delegate.
So the real intellectual challenge, they argue, is in that persistent, constructive digging to get to the absolute heart of an issue.
It's asking that manager who's planning an 8% sales jump in a flat market. Okay, how? Tell me exactly. Which products? Which customers? What's the sales pitch specifically? What will competitor X do when you do that? What are the weekly milestones?
And then digging into the capacity question. Do you actually have the right people to do this? Is it crystal clear who owns what? How are marketing and sales going to work together on this? Does our bonus system actually reward this specific behavior?
It demands real business knowledge, sharp judgment about people, intense focus, deep thinking, and frankly, the skill to have brutally honest conversations. It is intellectually demanding work.
Which brings us nicely to the next part, seeing this execution difference actually play out in real companies, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, and the book points out this common trap, right? Leaders often get promoted because they're brilliant strategic thinkers. They can paint a compelling vision, but they might fundamentally lack the know-how, the grit to actually make things happen, and that execution skill. It's way harder to judge when you're hiring or promoting someone.
Let's loop back quickly to Joe, the CEO who got fired.
Right.
His failure wasn't just bad luck or a bad market. It was an execution failure, wasn't it? He didn't dig into why goals were being missed.
He probably had the wrong people in key roles, people
Right.
who weren't strong executors themselves. There wasn't that open, honest dialogue needed to surface problems, like maybe a plant falling behind schedule.
And maybe those stretch goals were unrealistic precisely because they weren't grounded in the reality of what the organization could actually do.
Contrast that with the new CEO they brought in. Came from manufacturing a world where execution is everything.
What did he do?
He immediately started drilling down into the hows with his managers, setting really clear milestones, following through relentlessly. He fixed the execution first, and the results followed.
Okay, let's look at a less anonymous example. Richard Thoman at Xerox.
Oh, yeah. A really stark case. Thoman was highly respected, a known strategist, brought in specifically to drive change at Xerox. But his vision, even if it was sound on paper, was completely disconnected from Xerox's reality. They had deep, long-standing execution problems.
And his big mistake, according to the book.
Trying to do way too much, way too fast. He launched two massive, gut-wrenching, absolutely critical initiatives at the exact same time.
Which were?
Consolidating all the administrative centers and completely reorganizing the entire sales force. Both probably needed doing eventually.
But simultaneously.
The organization just couldn't cope. It was chaos, absolute chaos. Lost invoices, missed orders, salespeople spending their time fixing system problems instead of selling.
Customers must have been furious.
Furious. Morale plummeted. Cash flow went negative. The stock price just tanked.
Now, some blame Thoman, called him aloof or whatever.
Yeah.
But the authors see deeper execution issues.
Right. They point to Xerox's clubby insider culture resisting an outsider CEO. Maybe Thoman didn't have the real authority to pick his own team people focused on execution.
And critically,
the basic building blocks weren't there, the right people in the key jobs, strong core processes. They just didn't exist to support that kind of radical simultaneous change. The foundation was shaky.
okay, and another tough story. Richard McGinn at Lucent.
Yeah, Lucent. Started with so much promise, didn't it? Spun off from AT&T, the telecom market was booming, they had the Bell Labs legacy.
Looked like a sure winner.
But McGinn really struggled with internal execution, even when the market winds were blowing strong initially.
What went wrong there? From an execution perspective.
Well, several things. He didn't manage to change that slow, bureaucratic Bell system culture. The structure was cumbersome, unwieldy. Financial controls were apparently terrible. They couldn't even get basic reports like profit by customer or product line easily.
Wow, that's fundamental.
And he failed to confront or replace executives who just weren't performing. That's a key execution failure.
So they missed opportunities.
Big time. They missed key market shifts because they couldn't execute internally, couldn't develop crucial products like routers or advanced optical gear fast enough. And the authors are clear. These weren't just strategic blunders. They were execution failures. Meaning they didn't really know their own development capabilities. They weren't listening closely enough to future customer needs the way competitors like Mortel apparently were. They couldn't deliver.
And the pressure to keep growing revenue led to more bad execution.
Exactly. Chaos. Adding product lines that weren't profitable, making acquisitions they couldn't integrate properly, key leaders often left. Costs got out of control. Huge redundancies.
And then things got really desperate.
Yeah, the pressure to hit unrealistic forecasts led people to do almost anything. Excessive financing for customers, booking sales way too early. It just destroyed the balance sheet, piled up massive debt.
And McGinn himself.
The book paints a picture of someone completely out of touch, in denial. Even when his own execs were warning him, apparently a year before he was fired, he kept insisting the market was great when the signs of a downturn and Lucent's internal collapse were obvious. He just wasn't connected to the execution reality.
Okay, enough doom and gloom. Let's look at a positive example. Dick Brown turning around EDS.
Right, a much better story. When Brown took over EDS in '99, it was in real trouble. Revenue flat, earnings dropping, stocks sinking, culture felt outdated, structure wasn't working against nimbler competitors.
A classic turnaround situation. And his approach was execution focused from day one.
Laser focused. And he started by just getting to know the place. deeply. He traveled like crazy, meeting people at all levels all over the world.
Getting out there.
Yeah, and he started sending these weekly, very candid emails to the entire company. They became this powerful tool for him to force reality out into the open and start shifting attitudes.
Smart.
He massively increased the flow of information, got daily sales figures, other critical financial data, pushed right down to the top leaders. No more hiding in silos.
And accountability.
Huge emphasis on that. He instituted these monthly performance calls, basically intense operating reviews where leaders had to account for their performance against their commitments. Required, as he put it, intense candor.
Sounds tough.
It was. And if people couldn't handle that level of candor, there was talk after class coaching. He also held these 2-day meetings for his top 150 execs, forced them to see the entire business financials, the critical issues, making them see the business from my level, as he said. It forced teamwork, which was apparently totally new for EDS.
What about people? That's a core process.
Absolutely central to his approach. He moved quickly to remove underperformers. He tied compensation, bonuses, everything directly to performance. Used evaluation tools systematically, provided training, coaching, but wasn't afraid to remove people who weren't adapting.
That famous example about the salespeople.
Oh, yeah. His analysis showed something like 20% of the sales force hadn't sold a single thing in 6 months. Nothing. He made sure those salespeople and their managers were dealt with. That's driving accountability through the people process.
He also did a major reorg, right?
A radical one. Those old siloed strategic business units, the SBUs, he rolled them into just 4, later 5 major lines of business, designed specifically to force leverage and collaboration across the company.
That sounds risky to design from the top down.
But here's the clever execution part. He didn't design it himself. Yeah. He put the design in the hands of a diverse team of 7 key executives, the very people who would have to live with it and make it work.
So they had ownership.
Exactly. Apparently it was messy at first, lots of conflict. But the authors call it a crucial developmental experience. It forced these leaders to learn totally new jobs and, more importantly, totally new ways of working together. It worked because the people responsible for the outcome designed the system.
And he focused on service quality, too.
Relentlessly. Made service excellence a core metric, tied it directly to rewards. Client satisfaction shot up, which is obviously critical for a services company like EDS.
So the results, what happened at EDS?
Pretty stunning turnaround. Record revenues, market share gains, 11 straight quarters of double-digit growth in operating margins and earnings per share that shows real profitability and efficiency.
And the stock price
soared. The board directors were apparently genuinely surprised at how fast and how deeply he turned things around while changing the culture at the same time.
So the contrast really couldn't be starker, could it?
Yeah.
Xerox and Lucent, smart people, initial advantages, but they stumbled badly because of execution gaps. EDS, this troubled giant, gets its mojo back, specifically because of this disciplined focus on execution under Brown. It really drives home the difference it makes.
It really does. And that leads us perfectly into the third part of this dive, the fundamental building blocks of execution, what actually makes it happen.
Now, the book goes into detail later about creating the right culture and getting the right people in the right jobs.
Right. Chapters 4 and 5 focus on those.
But they start with something even more fundamental, the leader's own behaviors. These are the 7 essential things a leader does to drive execution.
This is the foundation. The first one, maybe the most important. Know your people and your business deeply.
This isn't about being detached, sitting in the corner office looking at spreadsheets.
No way. It's about deep personal engagement. Larry Bossidy's example of visiting that plant in Freeport, Illinois is just perfect here.
How so?
Well, a shallow visit is just handshakes, maybe a quick tour. His visit, it was hours of probing questions, getting into the nitty-gritty.
Like what?
Like staff turnover issues, how quality was actually being measured versus reported, why there wasn't a business development person focused on growth, digging into why they missed the forecast, how many other plants made similar stuff, could they outsource some things, how are they protecting their IP, were they using e-auctions for buying parts, were their computer systems talking to each other.
Wow, that's detailed.
Incredibly detailed. It was a real back and forth. He learned about the business, sure, but just as importantly, the local leaders learned how he thought, how to look at their own operation through an execution lens.
And it builds commitment, right?
Yeah.
Like Dick Brown connecting personally at EDS.
Exactly. Bossidy apparently followed up not just with formal letters outlining actions, but personal notes, too. That shows real engagement.
Okay, behavior number 2. Insist on realism.
This one's tough. Because, let's face it, reality can be uncomfortable. People naturally want to hide mistakes, avoid conflict, maybe live in a bit of denial.
So leader has to force it out.
Force it out and make it the absolute bedrock of every conversation. Bossidy talked about constantly comparing performance, not just internally, but against the outside market, against competitors. That keeps you honest.
That Allied Signal example was striking. The order fill rate.
Oh, yeah. Internally, people thought it was like 98% fantastic. Customers, they were reporting it was closer to 60%.
Massive disconnect.
Huge. And the point wasn't just to find the gap, but to focus on addressing the customer complaints, not arguing about the number. Bossidy used things like roundtables with employees to get unfiltered reality straight from the source.
Law makes sense. Number 3, set clear goals and priorities.
Sounds obvious, but in big, complex companies, people get pulled in a million directions. They need just a few crystal clear priorities that everyone can actually understand and act on.
If a leader has 20 priorities.
They really have no priorities. It just creates confusion and dilutes effort.
They mentioned loosened again here, didn't they, when things got really bad in 2002.
Yeah, their priorities became brutally simple out of necessity. Survival. Conserve cash. Focus on customers. That's it. Everyone knew what mattered most.
And that retail chain CEO example.
Right, the struggling company trying to do too much. He boiled it all down to just 2 things. Improve the performance of existing stores and raise gross margins and comparable store sales. Simple. Clear.
But he didn't just announce them, right? He executed on setting the priorities.
Exactly. He explained them clearly to his direct reports. Then he ran sessions for managers at all levels, teaching them what he called the anatomy of the business, the specific levers like inventory control or staffing levels that actually impact sales and costs.
So they understood the how.
Yes. And then he set clear quarterly targets linked directly to those 2 priorities and demanded 90-day action plans from everyone with rigorous follow-up. Results turned around dramatically because the priorities were clear, understood, and actionable right down the line.
Okay, number 4, follow through. Another one that sounds basic.
But it's maybe where execution breaks down most often. How many meetings end with vague agreements, but no clear who does what by when?
Happens all the time.
And then no one checks. The plan just evaporates.
That high-tech company example illustrated this well. The CEO wanting faster inventory turns.
Right. Purchasing needed engineering to approve alternative, cheaper parts. But the engineering VP was resisting, focused only on new product designs. Classic silo conflict.
What did the CEO do?
He didn't just let it slide. He surfaced the conflict directly, and then he created a specific follow-through mechanism, a mandatory monthly video conference that he attended himself, along with all the key players from purchasing, engineering, manufacturing. They had to report progress and resolve roadblocks right there. That's active follow-through.
Got it. Number 5, reward the doers.
Simple idea. Pay people for performance, link rewards to results.
What?
But so many companies do it badly. Often there's very little actual correlation between someone's pay, their bonus, their stock options, and their real contribution or performance.
Which leads to that feeling Bossidy called socialism.
Yeah, where the high performers see the low performers getting similar rewards and they just think, why bother? It kills motivation. Leaders need the confidence, the guts, to actually differentiate rewards based on who delivers and who doesn't.
The book digs into the how of doing that later, apparently.
Yeah, they promise more on why it's hard and how to build those systems in the chapter on the people process. But the essential leader behavior is making sure rewards align with execution.
Okay, number 6, expand people's capabilities through coaching.
This isn't just about judging people, it's about actively making them better, passing on your own knowledge and experience. Every single interaction, every meeting, every review is an opportunity to coach.
It's that teach a man how to fish idea.
Exactly. Not just giving orders, but teaching people how to think through problems, how to analyze situations, how to make better decisions themselves.
Ram Charan's example of the planning review was good here. The division head planning that big push into Germany.
Right. The plan looked ambitious on the surface. But the CEO didn't just accept it. He started asking those incredibly sharp, probing questions like, okay, which specific customers are you targeting? What products exactly? What's your real competitive advantage against these guys? How many salespeople do you have? Turns out they had 10. The competitor had 200. What's the background of the leader you're putting in charge?
Ouch. Exposing the holes.
But then, crucially, he didn't just shoot the plan down. He shifted into coaching mode. Okay, given these realities, what are some more realistic alternatives? Could we segment the market? Find a weak spot? Compete on speed or innovation instead of going head to head? It became a live lesson in realistic business planning.
And coaching isn't always about poor performance, right? Larry Bossidy's Charlie example.
Yeah, Charlie was making his numbers, but his behavior was terrible, abusive, undermining teamwork. Coaching in that case was about addressing the behavior. And sometimes coaching leads to the realization that despite efforts, someone just isn't the right fit behaviorally or capability-wise, and you have to make a tough call.
And they stress that most learning isn't in the classroom.
Right, maybe 80% happens on the job, tackling real challenges. So leaders are the primary teachers. Formal education needs clearer goals tied to real business problems, like how Honeywell used critical company projects as development opportunities.
Okay, last one. Behavior number 7, know yourself.
This one's about the leader's inner game. Emotional fortitude, strength of character.
What does that mean in practice?
It means having the courage to be honest with yourself about your own strengths and weaknesses, being able to handle the truth even when it's unpleasant, giving honest feedback to others even when it's difficult, tolerating different opinions and dealing with conflict constructively, being firm when you need to be.
It's the foundation for the other behaviors, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's that inner strength that allows you to invite reality, absorb potentially negative information, manage the inevitable conflicts that arise from honest dialogue. Without that self-awareness and emotional resilience, trying to practice the other 6 behaviors effectively would be incredibly hard, maybe impossible.
So let's try and wrap this up. Stepping back from all the details, what this deep dive really shows is that execution, the way Bossidy and Charan define it, is definitely not just admin work.
Not at all. It's a fundamental discipline. It's completely intertwined with strategy, and it is, without question, the leader's most critical job.
It's this systematic way of confronting reality, shaping it, driven by these very specific, observable things that leaders do.
And as we saw with those company stories, the tough times at Xerox and Lucent compared to the turnaround at EDS, it really is the difference between companies that just drift or fail and those that actually win.
And you mentioned the book goes deeper.
Oh yeah, this is just scratching the surface, really. It lays out a whole system, how to build that execution culture, how to really nail the people selection and development piece, and how to rigorously manage those 3 core processes: people, strategy, and operations. That's the how-to manual for making execution happen.
But the core takeaway, the big message, is powerful on its own. Execution isn't beneath a leader. It's not boring detail work to be delegated.
It is the work, the most demanding, intellectually challenging, and ultimately the most important work of leadership. It requires getting your hands dirty, engaging deeply with the business, the processes, and especially the people.
Okay, so to leave everyone with something to think about, building on that idea of the gap nobody knows.
Yeah.
If execution really is that crucial space between what we hope to achieve and what actually gets done, maybe take a second right now to think, where might that gap exist in your own work, in your team, in your whole organization?
Where does it feel like reality is maybe being glossed over or misunderstood? And what's one small step you could take, maybe even starting today, to actively engage with that reality, expose it, and start closing that gap?
Thanks for listening. Visit our library and subscribe below for more book summaries. This has been a Sprint Reads production.